The future's already arrived. It's just not evenly distributed yet. And if you think about it, this is why lag times are long on logistics curves, and why they're also S-shaped. You know, there is nature abhors a hockey stick. We don't have hockey stick curves. And the thing I think about in terms of explaining this is what's called the pace layer model. This was developed by Stuart Brown. He borrowed from some ideas of architects who used to talk about shear layers, and said, you know, the present exists because of a combination of slow and fast cycles. So think about this room we're in. That the fastest thing that changes in this room are the people who come and go. I'm a professional forecaster, and I will forecast that in approximately an hour, this room will empty out, unless I do a really bad job and it'll empty out sooner. That changes the fastest. And then more slow is where the tables are, and slower yet is the placement of the walls, the paintings on the walls. Slower yet is the building, and then the slowest of all would be property lines. That, you know, San Francisco once did burn to the ground just a little over 110 years ago, and when the buildings came back, they all came up in the same space. So you can think this is the layers that Stuart set out. So fashion moves the fastest, and nature moves the most slowly. And everything we do, every present moment exists as an intersection of all these fast and slow processes coming together. And sometimes, you know, in this building, you know, this Hilton probably should have been torn down about 10 years ago, but I would guess it will be good for another 30 years or so. There are cases where, in fact, this intersection of fast and slow is explicit. So, you know, commerce is influencing infrastructure and creating this building. But think about in Japanese Shinto, this is the Issei Grand Shrine, where the central honden is rebuilt every 20 years. It's a very explicit process. And actually, by the way, what's interesting about the explicit process is it's been rebuilt every 20 years now for several hundred years, and if you believe the full legend, for 2,000 years. 20 years is an interesting number because it means the junior worker working on his first construction of the honden is then a middle-level manager on the second construction, and is then the very esteemed senior seasoned professional at the third one. It's a little off topic. That actually goes pretty closely to what we think about along now. But just think about that it is the explicit intersection of, in this case, culture reaching up to infrastructure. Culture in the sense of Shinto religion explicitly saying we're going to redo this every 20 years or so. So you can think about anytime you look at something, look at a camera or any artifact, it's a combination of slow and fast factors. And then you see things like, for example, think about Steve Jobs and Apple. Well, the genius of Apple, among other things, was to move computers up above commerce and into fashion. You know, we replace our cell phones because it's not because they're broken, we're just tired of them, and we want the new fashionable feature or the like, where it doesn't fit your selfie stick quite right. And by the way, notice an important detail on this. This is literally copied out of the Clock of the Long Now. You can find this figure in the Clock of the Long Now. Notice that technology does not appear as a layer here. Stuart and I have talked about this a lot, and I think he's right. He says technology is not a layer, it infuses into different parts here. That said, when you use this in your own practice, my advice is take this and make a different version that suits you. I've done a couple of different of these here. I remember someone saying, well, there's something below nature, and I said, what's that? They were fundamentalist Christian. They said, God. Oh, of course. You can come up with your own layer. So have a sense of play and play with this thing. Now, what's interesting is, culture intersecting with infrastructure explicitly in Shinto gives a 20-year cycle on buildings. There are also cases where, there's a whole bunch of detail later. Really, it's the interaction between layers that matter. It's not the specific layer. That problems emerge in a particular layer, but they may be caused by something happening in a different layer entirely, and the solution to whatever the challenge is may be in yet a third layer. That's what slows things down. Sometimes it can speed things up. Think about this. July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong lands on the moon, not coincidentally right about the same time that the first microprocessor was built. Actually, it's not a coincidence. Because you think about it, you could not have gotten to the moon without integrated circuits. Rockets with vacuum tubes are not terribly reliable. And we declared we were going to go to the moon in 1961, and we went there in a really big rush. We got there by 1969, which is actually, we got to the moon in less time than it has taken the San Francisco Bay Area to rebuild the bridge that collapsed in the '89 earthquake. That took us almost 20 years, and by the way, the bridge is not so reliable. Do not cross the Bay Bridge if there's going to be an earthquake. It would be a very bad idea. But the reason why this happened so quickly was that there was an intersection down at the governance level, and one could even argue at a culture level. That was the height of the Cold War. So, we will bury you. Our kitchens are better than yours. And as a result, the United States had to figure out how to point out that it was the technologically superior power. So off we went racing to the moon, and one would argue that that is constructive interference between layers. In this case, a conflict at governance and cultural level actually led to what I think most people think is a really happy result at a technology level. There is no cloud so dark that it does not have a silver lining. On the other hand, you can have intersections that are not so positive. So before I say that, let me just bring this point home. Turbulent boundaries are the productive zones. And my metaphor of this is, of course, is Jupiter, courtesy of NASA, and that mid-equatorial band, you look right where the colors are changing, you see those wonderful swirls. That's turbulence, that's velocity shear. Physicists in the room will know that as Kelvin Helmholtz instability. Stick with velocity shear. But it is constructive velocity shear between these layers that is the seed that accelerates innovation. It's what's behind Silicon Valley. It's behind a lot of the innovations we take for granted. And by the way, one key point in all of this, as a forecaster, I think I speak for everyone in this room, the only tool we have is history. The only tool we have is history. And everything that happens in the future has an antecedent in the present. The uncertainty is how to put the pieces together. Nothing appears in the future out of whole cloth. It did not have antecedents. And a lot of us tend to whistle in the dark about that fact, but let's face it, it's true. So one of the rules I follow as a forecaster is always look back twice as far as you're looking forward. History, as Mark Twain allegedly said, does not repeat itself. Very often it rhymes. And if you look back far enough, you can start picking up the patterns. You can start seeing the interaction among all of these layers. So sometimes the interactions are not constructive. One of my favorite cycles, the Sunspot cycle, 11 years. This goes all the way back to 1610, and I don't have a newer one since 1980, but we're sort of around the peak of a sunspot cycle. And of course, we all know about sunspot cycles. Remarkably regular period, about 11 and a half years. The amplitude varies from time to time. So that's one cycle that moves very slowly. It's deep down at the nature level of pace layers. Well, then higher up, we have the cycle of Moore's Law, 18-month doubling period and the like. And think about the interaction of Moore's Law with that. And of course, everybody in this room, because you're forecasters, you're very familiar with it. We know what happens when we get a high amplitude event. This was the Carrington event in the 1800s, auroral phenomena of remarkable effect. We had a particularly large CME come blowing out of the sun, washed over the earth. I wished I'd been there. This was the one time you could have been able to see auroras while lying on a beach in the Caribbean, skipping pina coladas, none of that. Go freeze in the north, nothing against the northern country. And amazingly, the telegraph operators were getting shocked by the electrical potential, And the folks in Texas reported that there were half a dozen cows leaning against a barbed wire fence who were electrocuted and died. Texas, I leave it to you to decide whether they were telling the truth or not. Well, imagine this, back in the 1800s, all it did was shocks and telegraph operators. But every time you double the density of circuits on a chip, you increase their susceptibility to electromagnetic pulse. And so if you think about the intersection of that stately 11-year cycle at the nature level intersecting with this rapid sports car cycle of Moore's law, it's going to be really, really disruptive. Our computers will go down, our power systems will go down, and of course, Windows users won't notice any difference. So there's another aspect about nature that I will bring up. I hope you all know that you're about 7 miles from the San Andreas Fault, and about 8 miles that way is the Hayward Fault, which produced an earthquake. It was also quite dramatic. So if this building starts to shake, you will watch me run out that door screaming with my hands over my head, heading down the nearest set of stairs. I suggest you follow me. So in 1906, nature is the slowest thing here, except that nature is sometimes nonlinear. The San Andreas Fault moves on average about 2.5 inches a year, about as fast as your fingernails are growing. Except it doesn't do it gradually. And in 1906, it jumped 24 feet. The result was the 1906 quake and fire here in San Francisco. This was also an example where nature was made worse by governance and had an impact on infrastructure, because the quake kind of messed up the town. But it was a helpful government official, General Funston, who said, we need to stop the fire. And so we have at least one Marine in the room. If the Marines had been here, they would have done the right thing. He was from the Army, and his bright idea was to dynamite a fire break across the city. Which, of course, the explosions merely threw the sparks further out and burned down most of the darn city. So, what you have is kind of a crisis of intersection with layers there. But this is what happens when you get a big thing, and let's keep in mind, I think it was Will and Ariel Durant who said, civilization exists by geologic descent, revocable at any time. So you have something happen in nature that then bubbles upward, upsets infrastructure, upsets governance and the like, but it doesn't stop there. Turns out that the 1906 quake led directly into the global panic of 1907. That's the headline from the then dominant newspaper here in San Francisco. And for you all in the back of the room, I will read it. The Bulletin. Read the Bulletin's Reconstruction edition out tomorrow afternoon. Headlines in moon scale, moonwalk type, gold ship to pay insurance losses. What's this about? So here's the story. San Francisco actually burned in the late 1800s. And the insurers all said, well, they must have learned their lesson, and we had a pretty good fire department here and the like. And so insurers, and at that time the big insurance companies were all English, not American. English insurers were way long on fire insurance in San Francisco, thinking, this is a safe bet, they'll never let their city burn again. And the whole damn city burns to the ground, and all of a sudden the English insurers are having to pay out insurance losses to policyholders in San Francisco. Well, this is before the Federal Reserve was established. The Bank of England was our de facto national central bank, and we were on the gold standard. And all of a sudden, the Bank of England was shipping bars of gold bullion to San Francisco. They said, wait a second, it's supposed to go the other way. And at one point, they said, enough, we're not shipping any more gold to California. That triggered a liquidity crisis, which triggered the panic. So what you start seeing is, things up. A quake looks like a simple infrastructure problem that would just affect San Francisco, but in fact it affected the entire country. By the way, the Hayward Fault, if we get another earthquake like we had in 1868 on the Hayward Fault, the economic consequences for the United States will be equal to the economic consequences of the Civil War, except instead of happening over a 7-year period, it will happen in a minute and a half. So you should all hope that the Hayward Fault doesn't go anytime soon. It's actually overdue, but it's another story. So let me give you a quick case study on this. There's more than just nature. Think about, and I'm going to use an example very much on everybody's minds, the great challenge of the time, how to counter the great challenge of terrorism and suicide bombers. And we had the tragedy of the Charlie Hebdo killings in Paris earlier this year. And of course, one says, okay, so what's the problem? Say, well, maybe it's commerce. Is unemployment the cause? Unemployment rates in France are very high, and for the minority Muslim population, which is about 3% of the population, especially bad. Say, maybe they're not really Islamists, they're just really unhappy about the economy. Sort of in the same way that during the Cold War, people who were ticked off that the United States said they were communists, even though they were really communists. So maybe it's activated at the commerce level, or maybe it's at the infrastructure level. Should harden the buildings, should put up Jersey barriers and like. Maybe down governance, more policing, better detectives, more or at the level of governance, political inclusiveness. If minorities didn't feel so isolated, maybe be happier. And then of course culture. Is Islam to blame? Should we all talk to each other more and the like? I don't subscribe to that theory, by the way. Well, in fact, I think culture is just an excuse. This really wasn't about culture. In particular in France, the French Muslims are from the Maghreb, which, is Mediterranean climate. It's kind of like California. And anybody who's been to Morocco knows Morocco, Tunisia, it's kind of the laid-back lifestyle Islam. Not the kind of folks who run around inclined to throw bombs. But there's still an unwitting culture clash going on. After this happened, everybody was wearing buttons that said, "Je suis Charlie," in the same way, Boston Strong, or all those things we do. And so, for the average French person looking at it says, yeah, we are standing solidarity, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, honoring the right to disagree. And these are people who here has actually read Charlie Hebdo? You don't have to be shy. As a magazine goes, what do you think of it?
It's just lambastic, and it's trying to incite debate.
And are the cartoons funny?
Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're actually offensive.
Yeah, it's kind of vulgar and annoying, and it's proof. Forgive me for engaging in the cultural stereotype that every time I have a French colleague who is looking down their nose at me, I say, yeah, if you're so sophisticated, how come you guys like Jerry Lewis? But anyway, so it's just we, Charlie, we're still standing in solidarity with a magazine we may not read, except if you're a member of a Muslim minority in France and you see Je suis Charlie, you say, oh, they're saying they're the same sort of inconsiderate jerks like those editors. So you have kind of a culture clash. So things that look like that culture may not even be the kind of culture issue we're thinking of. But add in the economy and everything else, and the same message can have literally two very different meanings, as I suggested. Revolutions, I think, occur because of turbulence between layers. It's either economics hitting culture, and say, be very careful, I forgot who said it, but be very careful how you take away hope from a man. Oftentimes that's what happens with that. Other forms of revolution, I mean, what is it that attracts young men to the barricades of revolution? It's been a constant. Goes all the way back to the French Revolution. That's the only way you get a date. I see Clem Beasold in the back, and I am sure he was on the barricades in the 60s, and, meeting all sorts of, cool women. It's like, so there are lots of dimensions to it. But perhaps, just perhaps, the origins of the Charlie Hebdo killings have much deeper origins and go much further back than we realize. And just stepping out here and talking about method, one of the things I find that's really essential when talking with people about the future is you've got to overcome their biases. You've got to find that moment in time where they can just suspend judgment long enough that you can sneak in a new idea that might stick. And there are two ways to do it. You either take something very, very familiar to them and make it seem so strange that they're just shy. Or you take something that seems so strange and dangerous that you make it seem familiar and safe and comfortable. So let's take this breaking event, Islamic terrorism, torn from today's newspapers, being solved with Jersey barriers and endless wars and the like, say maybe the origins are a little deeper. Maybe they go back to the explosion of Krakatoa, August 27th, 1882. Krakatoa, as the map says here, was right in the Sunda Straits, and of course had a big impact. It sent clouds of volcanic ash around the world and had all sorts of impacts. But the biggest impact was right on the old, what was known as the Banten Sultanate. So the Dutch came in, Western European exploration and discovery of the New World can be described in a single sentence. One of my professors at Harvard put it nicely. He said, and thus greater pirates overtook lesser. So the Dutch moved in and they imposed their will upon the locals. And the Banten Sultanate sort of was still around, but it was getting weaker and weaker over time, and it was Dutch government and Dutch rulers. And folks were not entirely happy with the Dutch, but they said, at least things run okay and we're making a living and the like. Along comes Krakatoa, and it just wipes out everything. And it wipes out the towns, wipes out the farms, real crisis, and everybody noticed the Dutch actually did a really lousy job trying to put the infrastructure back together. And so they came to the obvious conclusion after a couple hundred years, said, what in the world good are the darn Dutch? And the result was that you have nature, Krakatoa hits it, infrastructure, causes a crisis in governance. And the result was the peasants' Banten revolt in 1888. So Krakatoa's explosion in 1882 and the social chaos it caused led to the Banten revolt in 1888. It also did another very interesting thing to local Islamic beliefs. This is Indonesia, not so far from Bali, very syncretistic attitude towards religion and kind of a mellow kind of beliefs. Well, what would happen to you if your whole life was completely wiped out by this massive volcano that came out of nowhere? You would probably get interested in eschatological things, the end of the world, get a little bit obsessed with the fact that, a bolt can come out of the sky and wipe things out. Well, that was really the birth of modern eschatological Islam, this robust Islam that, believed in an imminent end of the world. The sky god religions of the Middle East all share this in common. Christianity is a heretic sect of Judaism, and Islam is a spin-off of both, but they all share in common that at some level in their subcultural software, the world's going to end. So after this happened, people became really interested in the world ending at any particular moment. And that's where it started spreading backwards to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, influenced the Wahhabis and the like. So, also, the other thing that Krakatoa gave us was the Schrei der Natur, the famous painting, Munch's The Scream. This painting sold at auction recently for the record all-time high price. So, again, we had to wipe out a big chunk of Indonesia to do it, but we got a nice piece of art. These things, of course, loop back into culture. Again, if you have a big enough event in any one layer, it just starts ping-ponging through all the layers and having all sorts of unexpected consequences. But wait, maybe it goes back even further. So we want to shout out who this is. Jean-Marie Le Pen, a conservative politician in France, a very conservative politician in France who has bad relations with his daughter. And he was going around saying, it's not Je suis Charlie, it's Je suis Charlie Martel. So for those of you who don't speak French, Martel is hammer. Charlie the Hammer, it's like, wow. Did Jean-Marie finally get hip and he's like into a hip-hop group called Charlie the Hammer? Not exactly. Charlie Martel lived a fairly long time ago. In fact, Charles Martel, got his name at the Battle of Poitiers, the Battle of Tours October 732 AD. This has been described as the definitive battle in Europe. The cross against the crescent. The Umayyad dynasty Muslim invaders under Abdul Rahman al-Rafiki had come north from Al-Andalus, and they got within about 140 kilometers of Paris. And this battle took place over about 3 days. And Charles Martel, that's Charlie on the left, and Abdul Rahman is sort of middle in the right. Martel prevailed. And what was interesting about this at the time was he was just Charles before this battle. He got his name, the Hammer, because of this battle. He was an Austrasian prince and turned out to be the founding father of the Middle Ages because of this battle. And it was one of those fascinating moments in history where it came down to two individuals. Rahman not only lost, he died at this battle. And at that point, history became a tale of two sons. And by the way, why is he saying Martel? Well, he's saying, this is the battle. We are fighting the battle again against Islam, the European identity and the like. And that's especially interesting because think about this. How many people think Columbus was just yesterday? 1492, good perspective. Join our Long Now advisory board.
Sure.
Columbus is 520 years into the past from today. Well, here's a guy who's saying his first reaction to a suicide bombing or an attack in Paris is to invoke a guy in a battle in 732 AD. Charles Martel is farther back in history than Columbus is for us. If Columbus is 520 years in the past for us, Columbus sailed 765 years after the Battle of Tours. As F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And that events long ago have a big impact on people. And this is a guy who, anybody who says, you hear this rather culture-centric statement, the Islamic fighters are medievalists, they're living in the past, and isn't that terrible? But here's a guy who's literally living in the past and very much in the Christian tradition. So one of the things we need to do as an aside is pay attention to our own cultural biases and the biases of people we try to elect to office. Now, the outcome of this was kind of interesting. Charles Martel survived the battle. Abdul Rahman died. And then it became the tale of two sons. Abdul Rahman's son turned out to not be such a good leader. The Umayyad Caliphate went into chaos, and there was infighting, and even though there was the Battle of Narbonne after this, basically, the Battle of Tours was the high water point for the Muslim incursion into Europe, and from that point onwards, it was a steady retreat backward until the Reconquista and the abandonment of the Alhambra in the 1490s, and we all know that history. Charles Martel had a son, and his son was named Pepin. Pepin was the first Carolingian king, and Pepin had a particularly good son. The grandson of Charles Martel was Charlemagne, who, of course, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD by Pope Leo III. Well, the one other amazing irony of all this, the ironic twist, is that before this battle, there was no such thing as a European. There was no such thing as European identity. People were Franks or they were Goths. Charlie was an Austrasian. But it was only after this battle that the first historians started talking about Europensis. And so the great irony is that the Battle of Tours is what defined European identity, that incursion. And when you look back, you discover these remarkable coincidences of things that still very much live with us today. Now, one lesson I would take from this, nobody should dare criticize the Islamists for being medieval. So-called sophisticated Europeans are in their own way as medieval as the Islamists are, and I suspect many of us in this room have unexamined assumptions as well. And of course, the Islamists are in this picture. This is a capture I took of their Twitter page in March of this year, where we have this crazy pace of fast testing the slow. So these are people who are working at a deep cultural level. They're trying to affect deep culture change. They have no hesitation to use the latest in the most advanced technologies to try and accomplish things at other levels. As Captain Ahab said in the novel Moby Dick, my means are entirely sane, my ends are entirely mad. And sometimes that seems to apply to both sides of this. So if you pull back and you take it back to the pace layers, whenever something happens, your instinct should be, which layer is most affected? Which layer did it come out of? And where can I solve the problem of that? And by the way, I'll offer you my modest solution for the solution to global terrorism and suicide bombing in particular. We could do the Jersey barriers at infrastructure. We could do it at the governance level by, that's not turning out so good yet. And then we could make an argument that we should have, ecumenical culture and the like. Well, if the fastest layer is fashion, that's where we should tackle global terrorism. I mean, think about it. When's the last time someone in this room heard someone say, I am really frustrated with the global socio-economic order and governance order, and I really think we need to bring back Stalinism? Has anybody heard that lately? No. Of course not. Because Stalinism is really uncool. If you're a 20-something, you are not going to get a date with that hot chick if you're a Stalinist. And the solution here is to find a way to make being a suicide bomber, the least cool thing you could possibly do. If you want a fast solution to a deep problem, you got to work up at an upper layer. And the dynamic is because the dynamic of this. Fast layers versus slow layers. Fast layers learn. Slow layers remember. Fast layers propose. Slow layers dispose. And this is in Stewart's book, so this is, please do get a copy of it. Fast layers absorb shocks. Slow layers integrate shocks. Fast layers tend to be discontinuous. Slow layers tend to be gradual and continuous, except when they're not, in the case of an earthquake. And fast layers innovate and slow layers constrain. So, if you think about that, where you work at a particular layer, so imagine you're concerned about earthquakes in San Francisco. If you're an urban planner, you're going to be working at the infrastructure and commerce layer. If you're, or the infrastructure, and if you're a fire captain, you're going to be working at a higher layer. That a fire captain, their job is to respond quickly, to absorb shocks. The earthquake happens, the trucks roll, they solve it. But an urban planner is going to have a completely different time frame of perspective and an entirely different approach. He's going to say, well, let's make the building safer so we don't have to roll quite as many fire trucks and the like. So here's how I use it with my students at Singularity and also at Stanford. And there's a handout that goes with this. You all didn't need to have a handout, but you can imagine some people have, I'm sure in this room, use a similar thing. They say, okay, identify the critical issue, the challenge you're looking at. And start by saying, what's the source pace layer that this comes from? And really think about that. And then say, where are the impacts most felt? And then, which layer is most likely to be the focus of the solution? And above all, the real secret to this whole thing is time frame. Is being explicit about the time dimension. If you take nothing out of this conversation than this one point, and that is the present and the futures that we're all thinking about, the antecedents, all the little rivulets that lead down the streams to the great rivers that become the future, form high in the mountains and in the distant past. And they lurk sometimes completely unnoticed until they spring up upon us. Now, I don't want to end on a down note, so let me just add one positive observation. You were here. So that's a great red spot on Jupiter. And notice the little turbulent whorls. And there are some big, steady things and some small things. Well, the big one, the red spot, is a storm that's been there for a couple of hundred years. And the smaller one is a smaller storm. Well, you're here in the sense, this is as good a picture of Silicon Valley as I've ever seen. That the turbulence, that creative turbulence that led to all the entrepreneurship, the technological wonders that came out, are because of large, unchanging storms. You know, the defense industry in the 1950s and 60s, you know, the largest company in Silicon Valley was Lockheed until the fall of the Berlin Wall. All the other companies got the attention, but Lockheed was like that big, strange attractor. You know, Steve Jobs' dad worked at Lockheed. And there was, you know, after World War II, you'd say, well, you know, another piece of this was Vannevar Bush's report to President Truman, Science, the Endless Frontier, which established the NSF and all the agencies out of technology came on. And maybe that small one's Apple, and the new one emerging there is Facebook, and the little turbulence there are all the little companies that never made it big, or perhaps one of those little eddies will end up becoming a big, marvelous technological storm that will sweep over and amaze us in 10 years as, you know, the big circle that Google or Apple or the like is and disappears. So I'll stop at that point and take questions or comments. I'd love this to be a discussion as much as is possible in this room.